We have been in the book of Daniel, and we called this series Religious About It because there's really no other way to describe Daniel's relationship with God other than to say that Daniel was religious about his relationship with God. And we have kind of these weird feelings towards the word religion these days, and in some ways for good reason, because there's been a lot done in the name of religion that does not represent God, that does not represent the things that he says in his word. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that the people that we love and admire their lives all throughout Scripture took their relationship with the Lord very seriously, that they actually engaged in the practices of following God. And so it's important for us when we say that Daniel was religious about his relationship with God, it's important for us to distinguish what we mean, and important for us to distinguish the difference of when we say religion and we talk about Christianity, and religion when maybe we talk about other religions of the world. One of the reasons that we have trouble embracing the word religion is that when we look at the religions of the world, every other religion of the world hinges on your performance. Every other religion of the world hinges on your ability to say the right prayers at the right times, to do the right things, to make the right sacrifices in order to make yourself worthy, to make yourself acceptable. Where we are set apart as followers of Jesus is that Christianity as a religion does not hinge on your performance or what you do. It hinges on what Christ has done. It hinges on the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross, but more importantly, that he rose from the dead. And so Christianity as a religion is set apart in that the purpose of the religion of Christianity is not that Christianity saves us. Christ saves us. But what it's meant to do is draw us into relationship with him in a deeper way. That Christianity is a religion unto a relationship with an actual person. And when we see the life of Daniel, we see someone who is constantly taking a stand against a shifting culture. This is what we've been highlighting over the last several weeks, is that Daniel is someone that time and time again, he's given the opportunity to kind of shift and to fold and to buckle under the weight of peer pressure and under the weight of what's happening in the culture around him. But time and time again, he stands firm. And what we see throughout Scripture is that he's not standing firm just by sheer willpower of his own accord of standing firm. He's standing firm because he is a person who truly trusts and knows God. And this is the purpose of following him, is that we may know him, that we may become like him. And I would just submit to you today that the reason that Daniel was so often able to stand firm against a shifting culture was that he knew God, and because he knew God, he could trust God. Because we trust the people that we know. We gauge how much we know them on how much we trust them and are willing to put our trust in them. And Daniel knew God. And I want to encourage some people today, because I don't know about you, but sometimes the hardest time to trust is in the waiting. The hardest time to trust is in seasons of uncertainty. The hardest time to trust is in moments of our lives where, we have been praying and believing to see God move in a very specific way, and it just doesn't seem like it's happening. And if you're in the room today and you're in that place, I hope that this moment from the life of Daniel is encouraging to you. But I also want to say this, that I'm with you, that for every testimony that maybe you have heard from this stage about amazing testimonies of when we come back from Nicaragua and we tell you the stories of healings, people's ears being open, when we share the testimony of Kristen, how she was healed from anxiety and depression so many years ago. For every one of those testimonies, I also stand side by side in moments where there are people in my family who I've been praying and believing for healing in their bodies for years, and it just hasn't happened. There have been marriages that I have contended for and counseled and believed would be restored, that it did not end up how we expected or we hoped. And this is the tension of following Christ, is that often we want it to work kind of like a cosmic slot machine, where if we just put in all of the right coins, we will get the right answer. But the reality is we find ourselves in these in-between moments where we're praying and believing that God can and will move in our circumstances, but it looks like he's not. It looks like nothing is happening. And if we're really honest, a lot of times our discouragement in faith is not rooted in unbelief. Our discouragement in faith is rooted in belief. Because we believe that he can, we believe that he will, but we're in that in-between where he hasn't. And that is the breeding ground for discouragement. That is the breeding ground for the enemy to slip into our mindsets with lies and deception. And this Daniel chapter 10 moment is one of my favorite moments in the life of Daniel, because so far up into this point, like it seems like it's all worked out pretty quickly for Daniel. So far up into this point, he's challenged to eat the food of the king's table, and he is willing to submit to the test and says, hey, test me in this. Allow me to eat the food that is in line with the covenant of my God. See what happens. And at the end of just a short period of time, it was proven that the men who ate the food that was in line with the covenant of their God were better off. They were stronger. They were more prepared for their jobs. We see this quick turnaround and this quick answer. We see his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're thrown into the fiery furnace, and they're delivered in that moment in the fiery furnace. We see Daniel in the lion's den when he refuses to pray to the king. He's thrown in the lion's den, and it's one night in the lion's den, and the next day we find out he's delivered. But in Daniel chapter 10, we find him in this in-between moment where something that he's been believing for, something that he's been praying towards, something that has been foretold that it will happen, actually has the opportunity to happen, and it doesn't turn out how he expected it to happen. And I believe that so many of us can identify with this particular moment in the life of Daniel. If you remember last week when we picked up the story of Daniel and the lion's den, we talked about how often we have these mental pictures of what a Bible character looks like. We kind of get them locked in at a certain age and a certain time. Any of you have like family members that you don't see as often, and so they just get locked into a certain period in your mind? And then you see them like maybe a couple years later, or you see them and they've gone through a huge growth spurt and they look completely different than you expected them to look. I think this is what kind of happens if we study what's really going on in the life of some of these characters like Daniel, because when I think about Daniel in the lion's den, I think about this young man thrown into the lion's den, but history and the timeline of scripture would tell us that Daniel was about 80 years old when he was thrown into the lion's den. And he's between 84 and 90 years old when we pick up the story today. And I love that because what we've seen in Daniel is this consistent aspirational life, that it's not just that his faith is a product of youthful exuberance. It's not just that his faith is the product of being young and naive. He is a man who all throughout his life, to the end of his life, is faithful to God. That at each season we see he's faithful to God. And I also think it's important that we recognize that though the book of Daniel covers these different snapshots in his life where we see him young and we see him old, if you add up the amount of time that we actually see in Daniel's life, it amounts to about 2 weeks of his life that we have record of, spread out over many years, but about 2 weeks of his life. And often we look at these biblical characters and we look at their life and we just think it's like mountaintop marquee moment after marquee moment. But what we recognize when we realize that what we're seeing is 2 weeks of Daniel's life is just like your life and just like my life. So much of life is faithful consistency in the mundane, regular days that we live every day. And so we look at a life like Daniel and we think, man, I want to live a life of great significance where I do great things for God. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to hold alongside that the reality that the life that you live today in consistent faithfulness to God matters and is significant. That the significance of a life well lived for God is not just the marquee moments of our lives. It's the consistent faithfulness every day that compounds into the strength to stand firm in these moments. That's what we see in the life of Daniel. And we pick up the story in Daniel chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Cyrus of Persia, Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, had another vision. He understood that the vision concerned events certain to happen in the future, times of war and great hardship. When this vision came to me, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 whole weeks. All that time I had eaten no rich food, no meat or wine crossed my lips, and I used no fragrant lotions until those 3 weeks had passed. So at this moment, up until this point, we've seen Daniel serving under different kings and different kingdoms, and he's now serving King Cyrus in the kingdom of Persia. So if you're tracking with the story, King Nebuchadnezzar came in, conquered Judah, started to indoctrinate the young men of Judah with the ways of Babylon, and now we've stepped several decades into the future, and another kingdom has come along, the kingdom of Persia, and they have conquered Babylon. So what we're seeing in the life of Daniel is not just consistent faithfulness in every day of his life, but consistent faithfulness under multiple kings and kingdoms that are corrupt. We see him remaining faithful to God. And this particular king coming in should have been good news for Daniel, because this king, we know from the book of Ezra, told the Jewish people that they could return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And this plays into the story that we're reading today, because we know from Daniel's chapter 8 and 9 that Daniel has been reading the book of Jeremiah, which prophetically tells of the time when the Jewish people will be able to return and rebuild the temple. So track with that for a moment. What that means is that now what Daniel has been believing will happen for generations actually has the ability and the potential to come to pass. This king says, you can go back, you can rebuild the temple where you worship in Jerusalem. So why is Daniel in mourning? Daniel is in mourning because in this opportunity where the people are given the chance to return and rebuild the temple, Scripture would tell us that just a small remnant of people return. That most of the Jewish people that remain are not motivated to actually even return and to rebuild the temple. This thing that they've been waiting and hoping for generations now has the opportunity, and they actually refuse to go, and only a small remnant go. This small remnant comes up against great trials, a lot of persecution, and the work of rebuilding the temple actually fizzles out and comes to a halt. So this is where Daniel is at. This moment, this thing that he's been believing will happen and hopes will happen, has now had the opportunity to happen and has completely stalled. And this is where I think we can identify so well with Daniel. These moments in our lives where it seems like it's gonna happen. It seems like the thing that we have been praying for is going to take place. Like this is gonna be the thing that fixes the relationship. If we can just get into this house or this job, this is gonna be the thing that brings the child back. This is gonna be the treatment that brings healing. We come to this moment where we think it's going to finally work out, and it doesn't work out. And so Daniel finds himself disappointed and uncertain about the future that he's been believing for generations. And I love in this moment that it says Daniel mourned. Because the reality is that there are seasons of life where the appropriate response is to feel the grief of the season and to mourn. That the appropriate response to the circumstances that we're walking through is not just to simply put on a smiley face and say everything's gonna work out fine, but the actual appropriate response is to experience the grief and experience the loss and mourn. But I love that it doesn't just say he mourned. He doesn't spiral and unravel. It says he mourns, fasts, and prays. That in his pain and his sadness, in his mourning, Daniel is still the Daniel that we saw in Daniel chapter 6, where it says he goes to his room and prays as he always did. This is Daniel's response to every circumstance in his life, that he steps back. He doesn't deny the moment is happening, but he continues to be a person that fasts and prays and that presses into the things of God. And this is why over and over again, what we see in Daniel's life is that Daniel's heart is consistently moved for the things that move God's heart. Because he is consistently engaging in practices that fuel his relationship with God. He's consistently engaging in practices that grow his relationship with God. And you can often gauge the season that you are in spiritually by the things that are moving your heart. You can gauge the season that you are in spiritually by the things that get under your skin and by the things that bother you. When you find yourself like upset and bothered by trivial things in your life, it's a good time to back up and to really pray and ask, man, what are the things that are moving God's heart in this season? This is the beautiful picture of the book of Daniel, and there's so many different areas of his life that we could get into, of his vision of end times and his vision of things in the future to come. But the reality is that Daniel was always living for a future beyond just himself. Daniel was always believing for a future redemption beyond just his story. And in Daniel chapter 10, verse 5, it says, I looked up and I saw a man dressed in linen clothing, with a belt of pure gold around his waist. His body looked like a precious gem. His face flashed like lightning, and his eyes flamed like torches. His arms and feet shone like polished bronze, and his voice roared like a vast multitude of people. Only I, Daniel, saw this vision. The men with me saw nothing, but they were suddenly terrified and ran away. I love that phrase where it says, only I, Daniel, saw this vision. Because there are going to be moments in your life in the presence of God where God speaks directly to your circumstance, where God speaks directly to your situation. And I think the danger sometimes in a room like this is that we can come together and we can experience the presence of God. It's here in this room with us. And some people are going to hear a word from God, and some people are going to treat it casually and just move on as if nothing happened. And I don't know about you, but I want to be a church full of people that when the presence of God is in the room, I don't want to be the one fleeing. I want to be the one hearing a word from God in that moment. I want to be the one pressing in, listening for the voice of God, because they all sensed that something was happening in this moment. They all felt the weight of the moment. They all felt the heaviness of the moment, but it says some ran, and it says Daniel stayed in the presence and he heard the word of the Lord in that moment. And it says in verse 8, I was left there all alone to see this amazing vision. My strength left me. My face grew deathly pale and I felt very weak. Then I heard the man speak, and when I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted and lay there with my face to the ground. So we know there is a weight to this moment, that there is a heaviness to this moment. There's a significance to this moment. And it goes on to say, just then a hand touched me and lifted me, still trembling to my hands and knees. And the man said to me, Daniel, you are very precious to God. Listen carefully to what I have to say to you. Stand up, for I have been sent to you. When he said this to me, I stood up, still trembling. This moment is so significant because in this moment of discouragement, in this moment of waiting, in this moment where he's been praying to see something happen, and it's got this opportunity to happen and it's just not happening, the word of the Lord to Daniel in that moment is, you are precious to God. And sometimes when you're in a season of waiting, sometimes when you're in a season of uncertainty where you don't know if or how things are going to work out, you need to remember that you are precious to God, that he sees your story, that he sees your pain, that he sees your discouragement. But I love what it says. It says, when he touched me, he lifted my head. Our God is the lifter of heads. Our God is the lifter of our heads. And maybe some of you this morning are walking through a situation or a circumstance where you need God to be the lifter of your head. Maybe you're feeling the weight of a situation, the weight of discouragement or disappointment in your life. And what you need today is to be reminded that you are precious to God and to just allow him to lift your head in this season. See, what we see all throughout the life of Daniel and what we've highlighted each week is that really just the way that Daniel chooses to live his life is his ultimate witness and his ultimate testimony. Like the way that Daniel lives his life is what always ultimately opens the door for him to share his faith, for him to prove his faith to God. And the same is true in this moment. Like, can I just tell you, like, a lifted head in a weighty season might be your best witness. Well, when people see you navigating pain and discouragement and disappointment with a sense of encouragement and with a sense of having your head supernaturally lifted by God, that is a witness to those who see your life. And what I'm always reminded about when I read scripture is that our situation can be weighty, but our spirit can be light. We can walk through hard, heavy circumstances that we do not deny, that we acknowledge, that we mourn, that we grieve, but we can still walk through them with a sense of hope and a lifted head. Why? Because we know that we are precious to the God who created us. We know that he hears our prayer. We know that he has not abandoned us in our moment of need. And Daniel's posture under pressure was his greatest witness. Every time Daniel felt the weight and the peer pressure of culture around him, every time he had the opportunity to bend to culture, it was his posture of standing firm to the covenant he had made with God that actually distinguished him and set him apart. It was his posture under pressure that was his greatest witness. And a lifted head in a weighty moment can be your best witness. Psalm 3:3 says, "You, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high." I think for some of you in this room this morning, that may be the word of the Lord for your situation today. For some of you in this room this morning, you walked in here with a heaviness, you walked in here with a weight, and maybe the word like Daniel that's spoken to you in this moment is just the reminder that you are precious to God and that he is the lifter of your head. In this moment, Daniel does not actually know how this circumstance is going to work out, but it doesn't stop him from allowing God to lift his head. He doesn't need the details. He doesn't need the outcome to allow God to lift his head in this moment. And then this is where things get even more encouraging and a little bit weird. Because it goes on to say in verse 12, it says, "He said to me, 'Don't be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day you began to pray for understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your request has been heard in heaven. I have come in answer to your prayer, but for 21 days, the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to help me, and I left him there with the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia.'" So what's he saying in this moment? He's saying the moment that you began to pray, the answer was sent. And the delay is not because you're not praying the right prayers. The delay is not because God doesn't hear your prayer. The delay is not because you are not precious to God. The delay is because there is a battle in the spiritual behind the scenes that you can't even see. That the delay is actually an unseen spiritual battle. And I just want to remind you this morning that I'm not one of those people that there's a demon and attack behind every rock, but you need to be aware that sometimes the battle is spiritual. That sometimes the battle is spiritual behind the scenes. Something is going on. He said, as soon as you prayed, the answer was sent. And we've talked throughout this series about these moments throughout the book of Daniel where there's these Christophanies, where it's like this moment where Christ appears. There's actually some debate about whether this being that Daniel is interacting with is or is not a Christophany, a moment where Christ breaks into this Old Testament moment. I'll just tell you, I don't believe it is, and here's why. Because I don't believe that Jesus would struggle with the prince of Persia. I don't believe that Jesus behind the scenes would have any kind of struggle or delay. And what it says in this moment is there's this kind of behind the scenes battle going on, but that the answer has been sent. And for some of you in this room this morning, I want to encourage you, the answer has been sent. And the reason that maybe you can't see the way that it's going to work out, and the reason that maybe you can't see the details is because the battle is not in front of you, the battle is spiritual. The battle is behind the scenes. The battle for your children is spiritual. The battle for your marriage is spiritual. The battle for your life is spiritual. The battle for your purity and your integrity is spiritual. The battle is spiritual, and you have to fight spiritual battles with spiritual weapons. That is why in this moment, Daniel turns to fasting and prayer. See, when we go into a season of mourning, discouragement, and disappointment, it's easy to spiral. It's easy to get in this place of being out of control in our thought life. And one of the main places that the enemy likes to wreak havoc in your life when the battle is spiritual is in your mind. He loves to plant seeds of deception. He loves to plant lies in your mind. But we see in this moment that the delay is the result of an unseen spiritual battle. And I can tell you this, we've been talking about Daniel in the context of standing firm in a shifting culture. And I can tell you this, you will not be able to stand firm in a shifting culture if you do not recognize that the battle is spiritual. If you do not recognize that there's more going on to the battles that we face in our lives. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul says this. He says, a final word, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all the strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, against evil spirits in heavenly places. Therefore, put on every piece of God's armor so you will be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil. Then, after the battle, you will still be standing firm. Notice it says, after the battle, you will still be standing firm. There is a battle. You go through the battle. You walk through the battle, you experience the battle, but the difference is after the battle, you're standing firm. Why? Because you recognize that our fight is not with flesh and blood. And as long as you believe that the fight is only in flesh and blood, you will not find yourself standing at the end of the battle. He says, put on the full armor of Christ because the battle is spiritual. And so for some of you this morning, and maybe you've been fighting with all your strength for a certain situation. You've been racking your brain. You've been trying to figure out the best scenario, the right way to go, the right solution, and none of it seems to work out. Can I just invite you this morning to remember that the battle is spiritual? That maybe you're trying to fight a spiritual battle with natural weapons. Maybe you're trying to fight a spiritual battle with your own intellect. Maybe you're trying to fight a spiritual battle with your own reasoning, and what you need to do is, like Daniel, find yourself on your knees in prayer. Find yourself in a season of fasting. Begin to fight the battle with spiritual weapons. Verse 18 says, then the one who looked like a man touched me again, and I felt my strength returning. Don't be afraid, he said, for you are very precious to God. Peace, be encouraged, be strong. As he spoke these words to me, I suddenly felt stronger and said to him, please speak to me, Lord, for you have strengthened me. He reminds him again, you are precious to God. And he speaks peace, encouragement, and strength. What do you need while you're waiting for the answer? You need peace, you need encouragement, you need strength. What do you need when you're anxious and afraid? You need peace. What do you need when you're discouraged? You need encouragement. What do you need when you feel like you're too weak for the battle? You need strength. See, what I love about this moment is it reminds us that in the waiting, when we feel like we have lost the battle, when we feel discouraged, when we feel disappointed, that God can speak everything we need into our circumstance. That we don't need the answer to get peace. We don't need the answer to be encouraged. We don't need the answer to have strength. All we need to know is that he is fighting the battle for us behind the scenes, that he's working on our behalf. See, Daniel consistently stood firm in a shifting culture because he engaged in the spiritual battle. He stood firm and he loved well. He faced his impossibilities with an eternal perspective. His friends, when they faced the fiery furnace, had an even if faith that said, I believe he can and I believe he will, but even if he doesn't, I will trust him. And if we're gonna be people who are distinguished and set apart in a shifting culture where Morality is shifting, and faith is shifting, and trust is shifting. We gotta be people who know who God is and can trust his character. We gotta be people that recognize that the battle is spiritual, and so we fight the battle with spiritual weapons. We gotta be people of prayer. We gotta be people who fast. We gotta be people who press into the presence of God.